without a disability. Next slide. The repression of free speech during protests also has roots in non-traffic infraction enforcement. And it's something we have seen to a great degree in the current uprising happening throughout the United States and throughout California. For example, the enactment of curfews we witnessed in response to the protest against police brutality after George Floyd was killed. The curfews stem from a legacy of racist policies that have been used to criminalize, surveil, and control the movement of Black and other marginalized people in public spaces. To know the history of these laws is to understand why they're so problematic. And with that, I turn it over to my colleague to speak about the data that we collected.
Thank you, Tiffany. Next slide. So our goal as far as data is concerned in this report was pretty simple. We wanted to answer 3 basic questions about non-traffic infractions in California. Who gets them and for what? How many make it to court? And how much debt do people have because of them? So the long story is that there is no single database in California that contains all of the information from a single arrest or ticket from a police officer contact to the outcome of the judge's ruling. What we have in California are piecemeal collections of data that often do not translate from one source to another. So to provide the best answer we could to these questions that I stated earlier, we had to use 2 Department of Justice databases, the monthly arrest and citation register, and then RIPA, which is the Racial Identity Profiling Act, 2 Judicial Council reports, and 82 California Public Record Request Acts, or PRAs, for short for the remainder of this presentation, to local police departments, sheriff's offices, and county courts. Only 8 of those 82 PRAs responded back with data that had race and ethnicity information and enough instructions to actually use that data. Next slide. So here we actually get into those 8 PRAs that I just told you about. And so what we are looking at here, and I'm gonna read San Diego for you from this chart. So for every 1,000 white adults in San Diego, the city San Diego's population, 3.7 received a non-traffic infraction. For every 1,000 Latinx adults in San Diego, 2 received an infraction. And for every 1,000 Black adults in San Diego, 14 received an infraction. So that's what we mean when we say structural racism, racial ethnic disparities, all these terms. Literally in the numbers from the police, we can see how the outcome of enforcement is biased towards people of color. There's a lot more numbers here. I'm not gonna read all of them, but highly recommend you look through the report. Okay, next slide, please. So we start with San Diego because San Diego County has only 8.6% of the California population, but for the last year the data is available had 35% of non-traffic infractions. So even when we don't start looking at race, there's already a disproportionate amount of enforcement of non-traffic infractions in San Diego County. So what we're looking at here isn't all of San Diego County's data, we're looking at the San Diego Police Department. So there's other law enforcement agencies in San Diego County, for example, the sheriff, that could also be writing non-traffic infractions that make its way to the court. But because that court data does not have race and ethnicity information, we are using San Diego Police Department's data. So what we see in San Diego is that for every 1,000 Black adults, 14.8 received non-traffic infractions. Now, what we were able to do in San Diego, which we can't do in every jurisdiction, was look at not just the citations per 1,000 adults, but also the cited individuals per 1,000 adults. So essentially, let's say you live in San Diego, you get a ticket in January, and then you get another ticket in May, right? So how many people, individuals, were actually cited? So what we were able to determine is in San Diego, for every 1,000 Black adults, 10 were cited at least once. So even when we don't look at the whole, all of the numbers, what we can see is per individual, the Black adults are stopped more often. Next slide, please. This is Los Angeles Police Department data, and the biggest finding from LAPD was that Black adults are 3.8 times more likely to be issued an infraction than white adults. Sorry, a non-traffic infraction. And so what we're seeing here on this table is the top 10 non-traffic infractions issued by the LAPD. And these 10 infractions, the list you see in front of you, comprises 85% of all infractions issued between 2017 and 2019. So I want you to pay particular attention to the last bar, right? So at the very bottom of this chart, you see all Los Angeles adults. What that shows you is the percent breakdown of the population of Los Angeles, the actual city. So in Los Angeles, the entire population, 24% are white, 37% are Latinx, and 7% are Black. So, and then we go back to the top where the offenses start, and we see intoxication, drinking in public. So Black adults make up 7% of the population, but get 27% of these non-traffic infractions. Go down to loitering standing. Black adults comprise 7% of the Los Angeles population, but 63% of adults who receive this type of non-traffic infraction. Next slide, please. Alameda County. So like I said, the way law enforcement works is that in a county, there's usually one law enforcement agency that has jurisdiction over the entire space, and that's the sheriff. So we have the Alameda County Sheriff, whose data we don't have. And then there's other police departments in that county. So for example, the Oakland Police Department, the Berkeley Police Department, and the Hayward Police Department. What we were able to find is for all of them, there is structural racism. So for every 1,000 Black adults, 32 received a citation for a local infraction as a result of a police stop by Oakland Police Department. In Berkeley, Berkeley Police Department gives Black adults 4 times as many infractions than white adults when we control for population. And Hayward, Latinx adults comprise 31% of the adult population, but 61% of all infractions issued. And then another data source, for every 1,000 white adults in Oakland, 0.2 receive a non-traffic infraction. For every 1,000 Black adults in Oakland, 2.1 receive a non-traffic infraction. So 10 times as likely to receive a non-traffic infraction from Oakland Police Department if you are perceived to be Black. And I include the perceived to be Black part because this data set records what officers perceive someone's race to be, whereas all the other ones are self-identification. Next slide, please. Another police agency in Alameda County is called the Oakland Housing Authority Police Department. Essentially, their jurisdiction is the public housing properties in Oakland. And so for this, we showed you the data a little bit differently. First of all, this data includes a little bit of some numbers outside of the 2017 to 2019 range. It goes back as far as 2014 as the chart label states. And what we're showing you is that for the top 4 offenses given to Black adults by Oakland Housing Authority Police Department, that comprises almost half of all citations given. So again, The top 4 offenses given just to Black adults comprise almost half of Oakland Housing Authority Police Department's tickets and citations. Next slide, please. These are some of the other places we got PRA data from. So I'm just gonna go real quick. 22% of the infractions from the Fontana Police Department were for no dog license. In Bakersfield, Black adults make up 6% of the population, but Bakersfield Police Department gave them 20% of all non-traffic infraction citations. Modesto, Black adults comprise 4% of the population, but Modesto Police Department issued 8% of non-traffic infractions to Black adults. Next slide, please. Earlier, I mentioned RIPA, the Racial Identity Profiling Act. So this is a new law in California. Basically, every time a police officer stops an individual, that police officer has to record how they perceive that person's race or ethnicity. So what we see here, and what is the times more likely people of color, specifically Latinx and Black adults, are likely to be to receive a non-traffic infraction citation from these police departments. So the green line that you see on the table along the number 1, that is white. That's white adults. So how we read this chart is for every 1 white adult given a non-traffic citation by the Oakland Police Department, 5.8 Latinx adults were given a non-traffic citation by the Oakland Police Department. For every 1 white adult given a non-traffic infraction citation by the Oakland Police Department, 10 Black adults were given a non-traffic infraction citation by the Oakland Police Department. Again, this is what we mean when we say structural racism in the criminal justice system. This can be proven with data. Okay. Next slide, please. We take some of the numbers that we just saw on the previous slide for some of the larger jurisdictions in California, because we just want to highlight how much structural racism there is. So for the San Jose Police Department, for every 1,000 white adults in San Jose, 1.1 receive a non-traffic citation. For every 1,000 Black adults, 7 receive a non-traffic citation from the San Jose Police Department. And for every 1,000 Latinx adults, 2.4 receive a citation. Next slide, please. Again, the Sacramento Police Department also gives out non-traffic infractions to Black adults at a much higher rate than to white adults. So for every 1,000 white adults in Sacramento, Sacramento PD issued 2.5 citations. For every 1,000 Black adults in Sacramento PD issued 6.3 non-traffic citations. Next slide, please. And then the San Francisco Police Department, for every 1,000 white adults, 9 receive a non-traffic infraction. But for every 1,000 Black adults in San Francisco, 42 receive a non-traffic citation from SFPD. Next slide, please. So we took the PRA data from LAPD, San Diego PD, and Long Beach PD, and we plotted it on a map. And so you can actually go to this. The link is, Sam will share it with you. And what we are looking at right now is like what you would see when you go to this website. And this is the LAPD infraction hotspots. And what I want to show you is one of the features of this map to kind of really zoom in on the numbers and the data we've been talking about. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is the same thing, like the same last slide, but I just zoomed in a little bit more. And what I did was I clicked on one of the red dots on the interactive map, And this little text box pops up and says, on South Figueroa Street and West 95th Street, the LAPD issued 14 infractions. The race of the people they issued infractions to were 13 Black individuals and one Latinx individual. All 14 of them were women, and the average age was 26. And then because I selected this little dot in the 90044 zip code, what it tells me in the bottom right-hand corner is the demographics of this zip code. And what I see is that this zip code is 32% Black and 64% Latinx individuals, which I just think is really cool. I mean, obviously the data is horrific and structurally racist policing is terrible, but being able to view it this way is pretty cool. Next slide. And then, so this is the same thing for San Diego Police Department's data. What, I didn't click on a red dot in this one, but what I wanted to show was what you can do with this level of mapping is that we can tell essentially that the San Diego Police Department focuses its attention just south of whatever this place is, Balboa Park. So if I'm an advocate in San Diego and I know this is where policing is happening, maybe I can use this data or this map to help in this advocacy. I think that's it for the data.
All right, thanks, Colin. So our data show that non-traffic infractions are being used to police and criminalize the everyday behavior of Black and Latinx Californians. And the consequences of these infractions have an incredible impact on the individuals who receive them. Like Elisa explained at the outset of this webinar, the prescribed punishment for an infraction is a fine, but the consequences extend beyond a simple debt. Next slide, please. So we know these are low-level offenses, but police departments across the state spend a disproportionate amount of time enforcing these laws. In Sacramento, for example, police only spend 4% of their time responding to violent crime. As we know, these infractions are very often used against unhoused individuals. In Los Angeles, the majority of the city's expenses related to homelessness go to police interactions with unhoused individuals rather than housing or other supportive services that could help transition people experiencing homelessness out of that. Next slide, please. So police are spending a disproportionate amount of time and money enforcing infraction laws that result firstly in a fine. We know that individuals receiving infractions cannot afford to pay these fines and the fees that are added on to them. The clearance rate for infractions is only 46%, meaning that only 46% of all infraction citations given in California in any year are resolved either because the individual paid the fine or was able to challenge the ticket in court. This has resulted in huge additions to the $10.6 billion in criminal justice debt in California. For context, every single adult in California would owe $347 to eliminate that debt. Next slide, please. So the unpaid fines and fees from infraction citations can result in misdemeanor arrest warrants. This means that an infraction citation that can be given for sitting on a sidewalk or crossing a street can result in arrest because the cited individual did not have the hundreds of dollars necessary to pay the fines and fees. This chart shows that Fresno, Los Angeles, Sacramento, San Diego, San Joaquin, and Stanislaus counties all still issue warrants for failure to pay these infraction citations. Next slide. Kevin's story demonstrates the ballooning fines and fees of infraction citations. Kevin is a Black unhoused man in Sacramento who has received dozens of infraction tickets ranging from loitering to having a tent on the sidewalk. The fine for the citation tickets start around $154, which Kevin does not have. He is unable to work and he is unhoused. He can't even afford the bus fare to get to court to challenge the ticket. And he doesn't want to risk getting even more tickets for riding the bus without the appropriate fare. So when he cannot appear in court and cannot pay the initial fine, the citation increases to over $400. Sacramento still issues warrants for failure to pay or appear on these citations. So Kevin is at risk of arrest for his poverty and his housing status. Next slide. The enforcement of infraction laws lead to more interactions between individuals and the police. Our data show that infraction laws are disproportionately enforced against Black Californians. And these interactions between individuals and the police too often result in trauma and sometimes death. Ronell Foster was riding his bicycle without a headlight on February 13th, 2018 in Vallejo. This is an infraction offense. The police chased him down, tased him, beat him, and shot him multiple times in the back of the head. The consequences of infraction enforcement are absolutely dire, from unpayable, uncollectible fines and fees to death. Thanks, and I'm going to turn things over to Elisa now.
So the question is, what do we do about it? As you've seen, there are high disparities in this enforcement, high harm from the very first moment of the police encounter, high cost, and frankly, a racist history in terms of why these citations started being issued in the first place and why they're still given. So the question is, and we can go to the next slide, what's the right thing to do? Many of you know that we as Lawyers Committee have worked extensively on fines and fees. What happens at the back end? How do we reduce the debt burden? How do we stop wealth stripping out of the pockets of Californians and communities of color and low-income Californians? And we thought a lot about whether that was the right solution in this instance, given everything presented in this report. But we've also seen and because we've worked so extensively on back-end solutions, we've seen that none of them alleviate the majority of the problems. Even when there's an ability to pay system, our studies show that 50% of people who should qualify for some relief aren't getting it. Even when you do something on the back end to alleviate a warrant, the interaction happened in the first place. The harm of having a police officer approach you in a public space and knowing full well that it's likely a result of the color of your skin, the fact that you're unhoused, and having that interaction create trauma and harm from the initial moment, all for behaviors that are things that most people do every day. It doesn't make sense to rely on back-end solutions anymore. This is the moment to say, let's do the whole thing differently. And so our recommendation, after years of working on issues of this kind of enforcement, after talking to all of the individuals that we have and hearing their stories, after looking at these disparities in the data, is to end this type of enforcement. So, maybe that seems like, has that been done before? And it has in California. We looked at part of the reason that we stopped enforcing marijuana as a criminal citation, possession of marijuana, is that it had a because of the deep racial disparities in who got marijuana tickets. And that was borne out. Even, I don't know if folks saw in Hayward, every single person who received a marijuana possession citation in the last 2 years that it was enforced was a person of color, every single person. So as a state, we said, this is not a criminal offense. We're not going to enforce it as a criminal offense. And similarly, when immigrant and Latinx and a number of people who were vendors in LA and across the state came together in 2018, they got passed SB 946 that says, not a criminal offense to be vending without a permit in one of these cities, to be trying to make a living. Those were non-traffic infractions, all of them, and we've stopped this kind of criminal enforcement as a state. So our recommendation is to look at other solutions. One of the things I was shocked about is how many of these non-traffic infraction citations in California are for not having a dog license. And you see places like Modesto that have specifically stopped giving warnings about criminal citations for not having a dog license so that they can collect the money. I think for dog owners, it just doesn't make sense to create a system that is essentially a trap for people and their pets. And that's just one example. That this is a kind of enforcement that is not getting at the solutions to whatever the citation was designed to do. Tori and Tiffany talked about the solutions to homelessness. Maybe there isn't a solution needed for just I'm a person standing in a public space, loitering. Seems like we should get rid of. But the sum of that is that criminal enforcement is not the right way. It is not a just way to approach people in public, and the function of it right now in our society is to police the bodies of Black and Latinx and unhoused people because police have decided that they shouldn't be in public spaces, and we have to stop that. So there's some examples of how on the slide here. One thing we really want to emphasize at the end is a lot of this could happen at the local level. There are also obviously possibilities at the state level. We did collect a lot of data. There are different ways to analyze it. If anyone wants, and there's some data that frankly we're still in the process of collecting, that cities that never responded that we're still trying to chase down. So if you're an advocate or a person who cares about something and you have in your particular locality or city, let us know. We're happy to share the data that we have now. We're happy to share the data that we hope to collect in the future for any efforts in changing this harmful practice across the state. Thank you all for joining us. We would love to take your questions.
Yes, thank you so much everyone for coming to this event. We will now be taking questions from the press, and then following that, we will take questions from community members. So again, if you're a member of the press, it would be great if you could rename yourself with your name and the news outlet and type any questions that you have at this time in the chat, and I will be moderating. And Mark, I think we can take down the screen share at this time and show the panelists' videos.
I see Paul Bowden in the chat. We want to make clear that there are organizers who have been fighting on these issues for a long time in California, including Western Regional Advocacy Project and a number of groups across the state fighting for the Right to Rest Act, which would have stopped non-traffic infraction enforcement for sitting, sleeping, and standing. And so, this report is meant to provide additional data support for this battle that many of our colleagues have been fighting for a long time. It's, and hope that it's time, with everything that's happened this year in California, to change the way we do this.
I see a question from Marissa from the Mercury News. How does this impact our unhoused residents? I know you don't have specific data on this, but do you expect that they are the majority of people getting cited for these infractions?
Thanks, Marissa. We know they're a substantial number. Some of the data that we got did have in the address field of people something that said, the police's words, not ours, vagrant or unhoused or no address. And those, as you can imagine, were particularly common to see that kind of address in a ticket for sleeping or camping. As you acknowledged, we don't have, there wasn't a separate box or a separate column in the data set to say that someone was or wasn't homeless. But it is, I think our takeaway from this report is it is a huge number of the non-traffic infraction citations that are given in California are given to unhoused people. And it is by no means explains the entire problem. I don't know if Tori has anything else to say about that. Tori is one of our attorneys who really focuses on enforcement against unhoused people.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Elisa said. Of course, we don't have the specific data because that's not collected, but anecdotally, based on our practice in San Francisco and the Bay Area, we know that the majority of these infractions are being enforced against people who are unhoused. And that is true for all of the other advocates and activists that we talk to throughout the state.
If there are any other questions that anyone here today has, please feel free to put it in the chat. We'd be happy to answer.
Y'all are giving our ASL interpreters a rest. We're really grateful to both of you for joining us today.
So I see some questions popping up in the chat here. Do police tend to enforce those areas that are hotspots way more? From Kevin Ramos.
So that's what we think the data shows, especially when you look at it in the maps. If you look at those hotspots, those show up on the map if a high number of tickets were given. And I think it's actually also really interesting to look at the neighborhoods in which there are not hotspots, there are not a lot of tickets given, to look at a visual representation of the disparity in enforcement.
Thanks. And I see a question from Kate from KQED. Has this information been shared with the cities and counties that were assessed?
So we got all of the information from the cities and counties. It's information that they have. And we're hoping that this information in terms of the analysis and the context given in the report can be used in local advocacy. We at Lawyers Committee we primarily do direct services in the San Francisco Bay Area, even though we do statewide advocacy. So we want to partner with folks who really know what this is on the ground in their cities and states to make sure that their relationships with local officials and their relationships with people directly affected are put front and center in using this data at the local level.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a question from TJ Johnston from the Street Sheet. Do you have success stories of people who defended against citations? Did they rely on any nonprofit or public agency?
I'll let my colleagues chime in on this as well, but we used to run a program that did provide citation defense to over 2,000 people a year who got non-traffic infraction citations. And And during the course of that representation, found a lot of people who tried to come to court to challenge their own citation. And as folks know, it is somewhat difficult to navigate the court system. Even just showing up the 3 times that you often have to show up in order to get to a hearing where the judge could decide anything substantive about the ticket is a challenge without an attorney. There are no attorneys. That you don't get a paid for attorney in traffic court, so which is where these are heard. So you get the citation, it could result in a warrant or arrest, but you don't get an attorney. And so I definitely know of people who have successfully fought citations, but it is much, much more difficult if you don't have an attorney, and attorneys are few and far between who will represent in these cases.
I'd just like to add that we were able to speak with a number of people throughout the state. I shouldn't say a number, about 2 people throughout the state who do run like clinics, legal clinics that provide representation to unhoused people who receive these citations. And so we do have some success stories through them. And like Elisa was saying, the procedure itself is one of the consequences of these tickets. It's a deterrence to trying to deal with them. And there are, in some cities, legal clinics that are able to help, but there's far more needed. Thanks.
And I'm just looking, a lot of stuff going on in the chat. Someone has asked, Audra asked, what are some alternatives to policing that you would love to share with us?
I can say a quick thing and then let Tiffany take this, but I think we've seen that if you look at the, in the non-traffic infraction context, if you look at what the ticket is for, often it answers itself what the more practical solution would be. So technically, littering is an infraction citation, that a non-traffic infraction citation that can be given. It's on the books of almost every city in California, but most cities have dealt with litter not by actually issuing criminal citations to everyone who litters, but by trash collection and street cleaning. So, and similarly, there is a person sleeping in public, making the answer to that. Let's give them a citation they can't afford to, let's spend a lot of money to give them a citation they can't afford to pay, makes a lot less sense than finding housing for the person. Tiffany, what about other alternatives?
So I think one of our big takeaways here is that when you introduce law enforcement to these situations, the consequences can be anything from traumatic response, which also has physiological effects, right? So effects for your health, to literally death. And so one of the things that we'd like to see is not necessary, is actually to limit the interaction with law enforcement altogether, to take police entirely out of this equation, because just as Elisa has articulated, these are issues that can much better be addressed through either other services to the municipality or the county, or services that are community-led and community-run. And so, in fact, I think it would take some work to kind of go down the list of what type of citations are being out, what exact problem are we trying to alleviate by introducing the police here, and finding alternatives that way. But it's a very good question and something we've cared very deeply about.
Thanks so much for that, Elisa and Tiffany. We have a couple of other questions. Nikki asks, in Sacramento, they are bundling multiple infractions as nuisance, misdemeanors, and arresting people. Is this happening in other locations?
We've seen that happen in the Bay Area, and other advocates, as I said, we don't represent people in LA, so would love for people to chime in the chat. It looks like some people already are, about what the practices are across the state. but it is sort of an insidious, like, we could issue a warrant because you can't afford to pay this, but that's not fast enough for us. We really just want to be able to pick you up right now and arrest you because have been standing here multiple times, or you've been found here in public multiple times against what the police would prefer. So yeah, that's a pretty harmful practice. And I will say, when we go to court on these, you often have a judge that says, there's so many, and imputes wrongdoing from the volume of tickets, even though every single one of the tickets was for totally benign, everyday human behavior.
Yeah, and I'm loving what I'm seeing in this chat, people really sharing resources and their personal experiences with each other. There's so much community and power in this group and Zoom room that we have. Matthew asks, do you have advice on pressuring our local city councils and police departments to remedy these issues? And I'll let Lisa or whoever take that question.
I have ideas, but I've been talking a lot. Does anyone else on the team want to jump in first? I mean, I think we've seen in our campaigns that using, that there are a few key, and many people in this chat can speak to this better than I can, but a few key things. One is people power, having organizing, having a number of people who are willing to call and talk to local officials about the problem. Two is, and crucially, people who are directly affected by it. Two is cities, for better or for worse, often respond to data like this report. And again, we're hoping that this will be useful in that kind of advocacy. Three is often looking at the particular cost, the budget line items of this kind of enforcement, and showing just how both what does it cost to do the enforcement, and on the back end, how uncollectible the debt that results from this enforcement is, can be done at a local level to great effect. And then for, media, getting the word out so that more people can join in for the cause of change or understand the problem.
Thanks. And we have another question from Christopher. Is there a program that teaches the laws and civil rights of every city and state? And will that program be issued to all levels of education, to every demographic, communities of class, and environment?
I wish, Christopher. Is there? Yeah, I mean, that would be wonderful. We do have, colleagues in a number of cities in California who know the local laws well and could provide information. And we're also willing to share information that we have about what the local laws are. Obviously, this information, this report is somewhat aggregated, and we could give the specific code sections and things like that for cities that we were able to get, for which we were able to get data. But there is no source that I'm aware of that has created something as comprehensive as what you suggest, which would be wonderful.
Yeah, it would be great for people to have access to their rights without having to know them, right? So Anne asks, are there city councils in California or nationwide that have adopted the specific reforms you are calling for that might serve as models?
So this is, I know that in New Orleans and another city in the South, there have been advocates who are working at the local level to repeal sort of batches of laws in this category, this sort of non-traffic infraction of enforcement of everyday behaviors categories, and take them off the books. The examples I know of, we sued to get a loitering law off the books in Oakland and won that case in 2018. The examples that I know of are mostly around loitering, and some around bundles, or sort of when advocates have tried to get bundles of citations or laws off the books, a few of those reforms worked, even though it wasn't the whole group of tickets that needed to happen. And we've seen, moratoriums in some places, which may be a helpful first step for some cities. Plus the examples I gave about the statewide laws that we all know have gone through.
Amazing, thank you. And I just wanted to highlight some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat, just of what community has been doing with the Western Regional Advocacy Project, and members and allies have started a multi-state Stop the Sweeps campaign that's working to create defense clinics to fight the enforcement of a lot of these types of citations until there is a bill to get the right to rest passed. In San Francisco, there's a community-led effort to create alternatives to police response to homelessness, and the San Francisco Police Commission passed a resolution supporting this. There are citation clinics in Orange County being run by Elder Law and Disability Rights, and there's also an initiative to have a neighbors pause the calls to the police, working to respond to calls that would have gone to the police. So I really just wanted to highlight that so people see all of the great grassroots things that are happening on the ground all over California, as we see a lot of this really devastating statistics about non-traffic infractions. And I just want to quickly ask presenters here, what is the next step? What is the vision after this report? And what will LCCRSF do along with community partners? What's the hope?
I mean, I think one of the important things when so many things have fallen apart and so many people have organized to make them better in a year like this is to keep pushing for what we really want, what is really needed, the solution that actually makes sense. Because holding on to that vision in a time when we're really far from the ideal, there's power in that. So, I think looking at how we can take away piece by piece this kind of enforcement that causes so much harm and is so structurally racist, with the end goal in mind that it doesn't exist anymore, is the goal. I don't know if that answered your question.
That was great. Is there anything else that presenters would like to add as we wrap up this webinar? If not, then thank you so much everyone for attending. Again, you'll get a recording of this event. Please share this report with folks in your community and with your local cities and counties. And if anything, you want more data, more conversations, I will leave my information in the chat, and please feel free to reach out. Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks to everyone who joined. Grateful to spend this hour with you.